They thought arresting a 72-year-old retired teacher would be the end of the story, but it was only the first shot in a war they never saw coming. When Martha Johnson was led away in handcuffs, the town saw an easy target. What they didn't see was the man boarding a plane, the most decorated Green Beret alive, coming home to make them answer for it. Rain polished the street like onyx and turned the gallery's brick facade into a gleaming monument, a place that smelled of citrus polish and old money. Martha Johnson paused just inside the doorway, letting the warmth and the soft hum of strings from a hidden speaker fold around her. At 72, she wore dignity the way others wore perfume, subtle, unmistakable, lingering after she'd moved on. The black dress fit cleanly at her shoulders. The pearls lay cool against the hollow of her throat, a gift from Robert on their 40th. She pressed her palm to them once, then smiled as laughter rose and fell among people she had taught, or taught the children of, or once told to chew with their mouths closed in the school cafeteria. She'd helped thousands spell responsibility and learn what it actually meant. Tonight she had come for a former student's first big show, that, and to be visible in a town that was forgetting whose hands built the roads beneath their polished shoes. From the corner, Victor Preston watched her glide through the room like the last lamplight on a dark street. He could sell a painting to a man who'd come for a glass of water, and tonight his tuxedo seemed cut from the same cloth as his smile. Cameras flashed in the far gallery where the Callaway diamond necklace, sapphires like droplets of midnight set in platinum, rested under glass beside a card that used the word prestigious 3 times. Martha passed it on her way to James Turner's centerpiece, the boy who once stayed after class to scrub brushes, and who now painted history into thunder and color. The crowd around his work was a ring of eager faces. When he saw her, he parted it the way a body of water parts for a ship. Miss Johnson. The name softened under his breath. He hugged her as if he were still 10 and she had just slipped a note of encouragement into his backpack. You came. I would not have missed this if the sky itself were falling, she said, and in truth it sounded like it might. Rain tapping an urgent code against the windows, thunder rolling slow as a judge rising from a chair. Around them, the county elite moved like a school of fish, smooth, synchronized, instinctively avoiding anything that made them question their reflection. Some offered Martha the polite nod owed to a person who had kept order in their childhoods. Most let their gaze pass over her, like a painting they thought too small for their wall. In a far corner, a tall man with silver hair and a face that had never been told no, lifted an untouched flute of champagne and studied her with a hunter's patience. His presence didn't yet have a name for her, just a temperature, the chill that happens when a cloud crosses the sun. James leaned in, pointing out the brushwork in the mural that stitched together a century of black Westwood, barber chairs and Sunday hats, a teacher at a chalkboard, men lifting a frame of a new house while children chased a tin hoop. You told me color has a memory, he said. I wanted to paint it so no one could claim they forgot. They will try, Martha murmured, pride warming her chest, but some truths are stubborn as oak. A ripple moved through the gallery then, a hush that drew eyes like the intake of tide. Preston stepped into the center of the room, palms lifted in apology, the practiced gravity of a man who hosted crises for a living. Ladies and gentlemen, he called, voice rich, I'm afraid the sea, all-the-way necklace is missing. The word slid down the spine of the room, missing. Gasps and the sudden hive buzz of whispered calculations, value, motive, scandal. Somewhere a glass ticked against marble. Preston's gaze flitted, pinned, moved on. Security has been notified. The police are en route. Please remain inside while we resolve this. Martha's heartbeat did not quicken, but she found herself glancing toward the display case she had passed earlier. The mirrored pedestal stood like a stage waiting for a performer who wouldn't arrive. Something else moved, barely more than the flicker of a look, between Preston and the tall man with silver hair. As lightning stitched the outside sky, the gallery doors opened and the air changed. 2 officers entered, one heavy-shouldered with a resting scowl, the other compact, eyes quick as beads on a string. Evening, the larger one said, and the word sounded like a warning. I'm Officer Crow, this is Officer Payne. Their boots printed water-dark crescents on the tile as they crossed to Preston, who spoke to them in a murmur and then, too confidently, too smoothly, lifted a hand and pointed, at Martha. Crow's face didn't move. He walked toward her with the inevitability of a tide. Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to step over here with us. James stepped in front of Martha before he could think better of it. That's my teacher. You don't talk to her like, sir, Payne cut in, the word sir flat and thin. Step aside. Martha put a hand on James's arm and felt the tremble in his forearm. "It's all right," she said, soft as a lullaby, and then to Crow, "What is it you need?" Crow looked at her in the way men look at doors, something to be opened, not greeted. "We got a report you were near the necklace right before it went missing." "I walked past the case on my way to the paintings," Martha said. "This is my former student's night. I came to see his work." Payne flick. Ketta's gaze to the purse at her elbow. "We'll have a look." "You may look with a warrant," Martha answered. Calm wasn't something she put on, it was the bone beneath her skin. "I have taught this town's children for 50 years. I know the difference between request and demand." The phones rose like an orchard in bloom. A reporter who had come for society copy turned like a weather vane toward the storm. Crow's jaw ticked. "Ma'am, cooperate and we all go home sooner. Or we do this properly," she said. And somewhere inside the gallery, the tall, silver-haired man's expression tightened. Payne's fingers already rested on the cuffs at his belt, the metal smile of them eager. "Obstruction, then." James's voice cracked into the air, raw. "Are you serious? You're going to cuff—" Crow's palm came up without touching him, and the promise of force hung between them like ozone. "Last warning." Martha lifted her chin. She did not bargain with storms, and she did not beg men who mistook power for purpose. She extended her wrists. The cold bit and the first camera flash found the angle that would replay on every screen in Westwood by midnight. A black elder in pearls, hands bound, eyes level. Humiliation should have been hot. Instead, it brought a clean winter clarity. She caught faces as they turned away, not wanting to know themselves. She also caught Emma Wilson's eyes, wide, stricken, behind a tray of flutes, the girl she'd taught to diagram sentences now trapped in one she didn't know how to end. They walked her through a corridor of whispering mouths. Always seemed so proper. You never know. The rain had stopped outside, but the streetlights made stars of the droplets still clinging to the awning. As they guided her into the cruiser, Payne angled her head like she might bruise the paint with her resolve. In the back seat, the vinyl smelled of old coffee and night shifts. Martha folded her hands in her lap as if at a Sunday service. Crow glanced at her in the rear view, a look that landed and bounced off. People cried back there. People begged. She was counting her breaths, steady as knitting. At the precinct, fluorescent light bleached color from the world. Papers moved, keys rang against unseen metal teeth. They put her in a small room meant to make people smaller. Crow spread a folder on the table, though there was nothing inside it but the idea that there should be. Payne asked questions like stones thrown into a well. "When did you last see the necklace?" "When I walked past it." "Did you touch the case?" "No." "Anyone vouch for you?" "Half this room grew up in mine," she said, and let silence point at the absurdity. Crow leaned in, breath like coffee left on a burner. "Ma'am, you don't want this to get hard. You already decided it would be," she said, and the words fell between them like a line chalked on a playground. He sat back, offended that the chalk might not be his. Time can be a blunt instrument in a room with no clock. They left her, returned, left again. She asked for water and did not drink it. She asked for nothing else. Through the E-way glass, Detective Carter watched with the expression of a man who had once believed in a simpler world and now knew better. He recognized the name. He recognized the posture, the straightness that meant a spine had been trained in storms long before he wore a shield. At last, Crow nodded at Payne, and Payne unlocked the cuff from her right wrist and led her to a rotary phone that looked like it remembered a different decade when calls were weightier because the cord kept you honest. The female officer, posted in the corner, watched with an interest she tried to smooth into indifference. Martha lifted the receiver. The dial tone was a horizon. She pressed numbers she had never forgotten. On the second ring, the world on the other end changed shape. She did not waste words, and did not let any tremor into the few she chose. Her voice was steady enough to rest a glass of water on. "I need you." The line went quiet for a beat, and then a voice answered, deep, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that had made men in war zones freeze where they stood. "Where are you?" Martha's gaze swept the empty room, the camera above the door, the glass where shadows shifted behind it. "Westwood County Police Department," she said evenly. "They say I stole a necklace. It's a lie. They mean to keep me here. Understood." 3 seconds of silence followed, but in those seconds something changed. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, as though even the oxygen knew someone was coming. "I'll be there by morning," the voice said, then softer, with an intimacy that did not lessen its steel. "Do not speak to anyone else until I arrive." Martha replaced the receiver and turned back to the officer watching her. The woman expected tears, pleading, the usual performance of the guilty or the scared. Instead, Martha smoothed her jacket and said, I'm ready to go back now. She returned to the interrogation room with the slow, calm stride of someone who had just placed her first chess piece. Hundreds of miles away, Master Sergeant Elijah Johnson closed his secure line and stood still in the dim-lit briefing room of a military installation. His team, 3 men who had followed him through jungles and deserts, stopped their quiet conversation. They had never seen that look in his eyes outside a war zone. Problem? Marcus, the comms specialist, asked carefully. Situation, Elijah replied. We're wheels up in 10 minutes. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The men moved, wordless, gathering gear with the efficiency of soldiers who had been trained to act before asking questions. Within 30 minutes, a private jet was cutting through the night sky, its passengers already working. Marcus's fingers flew across a keyboard, pulling up Westwood County news feeds. It's already trending, he said grimly, turning the laptop so Elijah could see the grainy cell phone video of Martha being led away in cuffs. Local news outlets pushed it inside an hour. Somebody wanted this public. Elijah's jaw tightened. Good, he said finally. Public means it can't disappear quietly. Back in Westwood, the precinct hummed with a strange electricity. Word had spread. The arrested woman's son was coming. Younger officers whispered about it between calls. They say he's the most decorated Green Beret alive, one patrolman said over coffee. Crow snorted. Decorated or not, he's not running this station. She'll break before morning. But Crow didn't sound as confident as he wanted to. He'd seen the way Martha just waited. Not defiant, not frightened, just patient, as if time was on her side and not his. Detective Carter passed them in the hall, muttering under his breath, "You two better pray you got this one right. If that man is who I think he is, you're about to have hell walking through your front door." At 3 a.m., Martha was still sitting, still silent. They had tried questions, threats, the long pauses meant to wear her down. None of it worked. She hasn't said a word since the call, Payne grumbled, pacing outside the observation room. She doesn't have to, Carter said from the doorway, his tone dark. Her son's gonna do all the talking when he gets here. And as if summoned by the words, the phone on the sergeant's desk rang. A clipped, calm voice identified itself and made a demand. Access to the prisoner by dawn. The sergeant swallowed, nodded, hung up, and looked at his officers. You might want to put the good coffee on, he said quietly. This man isn't coming for a visit. He's coming for a reckoning. Dawn broke over Westwood County with streaks of fire across the sky. The precinct parking lot was already half full with reporters hoping for a follow-up to the arrest that had rocked the town. When the black SUV rolled in and the man stepped out, cameras swung as though yanked by a single invisible hand. Elijah Johnson did not hurry as he crossed the pavement. He didn't need to. Every step carried the weight of someone who had walked through firefights and come out standing. 2 men followed behind him, one with a laptop bag, the other with the bearing of a man who had seen the inside of a courtroom and the outside of a battlefield. Inside, the station grew quiet. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The room seemed to pull taut as Elijah entered, his gaze sweeping over officers, desk clerks, and walls as if memorizing the layout. I'm here for Martha Johnson, he said, voice calm, even courteous. Crow emerged from the hallway, trying for casual. Visiting hours don't start until... I'm not a visitor, Elijah said softly. Something about the way he said it made Crow falter, just half a step. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It was the silence of a predator deciding whether to strike. From the holding cell hallway, Martha heard her son's voice and smiled. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, did not tremble. She simply waited, serene as sunrise, for the moment the door would open. The holding cell door groaned open with the sound of metal dragging across stone. Martha looked up, and there he was, her son. The room seemed to grow smaller with him in it, the fluorescent light catching on the faint silver at his temples, the creases around his eyes carved from sandstorms and years of command decisions. For the first time since the arrest, emotion flickered across Martha's face, a smile that was both weary and proud. She rose from the hard bench with dignity and stepped toward him. Elijah. Mom. His voice softened only for her. The soldiers flanking him waited in the hallway like shadows, letting the reunion hang in the quiet. Elijah crossed the room and embraced her, and for a heartbeat the warrior became the boy who used to sit at her kitchen table, carefully polishing his boots before Sunday service. You came. Always, he murmured, then turned, his hand still lightly on her shoulder. Take off the cuffs. Officer Payne, standing just inside the threshold, frowned. Sir, we can't just take them off. The words were not shouted. They were measured, quiet, but heavy enough to silence the corridor. Payne hesitated, glancing toward Crow. Crow's jaw flexed. Something in Elijah's calm stare forced his hand. With a reluctant grunt, Payne stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. Martha rubbed her wrists, the red marks already fading beneath her dark skin. She held her head high as though being freed was nothing more than a formality. "Thank you," she said, not to the officers, but to her son. Elijah turned fully now, facing Crow. "You arrested my mother in front of cameras without evidence. You held her overnight without counsel. Explain yourself." Crow squared his shoulders, trying to regain control. "We had probable cause." "Probable cause," Elijah cut in, stepping closer. His voice was low, but each word hit like a hammer. "Do you have video evidence, witness statements, physical proof?" Crow hesitated. "We have testimony." "From who?" Elijah pressed, unblinking. "The gallery owner who just happened to have cameras malfunction for the exact 20 minutes the necklace supposedly disappeared. The same gallery owner who received a wire transfer at midnight from a shell company owned by Charles Remington." Crow blinked, caught off guard. "How do you—" "My team has been working since the moment she called," Elijah said, gesturing toward Marcus, who had appeared behind him, laptop under his arm. "You've been played. This wasn't an investigation. It was a setup." Detective Carter, who had been silently watching from the observation window, stepped into the hallway now. "He's not wrong." Crow turned, irritated. "Carter, stay out of this." "No," Carter said flatly. "You two made a mess because you were too eager to give Remington what he wanted. You just turned this whole department into the muscle for a real estate scam." The corridor went quiet. Even the youngest officer by the desk froze, wide-eyed. Chief Henderson appeared at the far end, drawn by the low murmur that had grown into a standoff. His face was lined, tired, but not unkind. "Mr. Johnson, let's talk in my office." Elijah didn't look away from Crow until Crow glanced down first. Only then did he nod to the chief. "Fine, my mother comes with me. No more cells." Minutes later, they were in Henderson's office. Marcus set up his laptop on the chief's desk and began pulling up data. Camera outage logs, suspicious bank transactions, metadata showing that news crews had been tipped off before the arrest was made. "This is what we've uncovered in 12 hours, Marcus said, scrolling through a list of evidence that painted a picture too clean to be coincidence. "If we can find this, the FBI can find triple." Chief Henderson sat back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Damn." "Here's the situation," Elijah said, his voice level but carrying the quiet authority of command. "My mother walks out of here today with her name cleared. We move this hearing up. No waiting until Monday, no hidden transfer orders. And in return, you still have a chance to look like you value the rule of law in this county. Or," he let the silence hang, "this goes federal by nightfall and ever. I officer who touched this case gets named in the civil rights suit we're already preparing." Henderson stared at him. There was no threat in Elijah's voice, but there was no doubt he meant every word. "I didn't sign up to railroad a school teacher," Henderson said finally. He picked up the phone and began making calls. Outside the office, Crow and Payne sat stiffly, watching Martha, who sat in a chair, serene as a queen awaiting an audience. For the first time, they looked uncomfortable. Payne muttered, "This is going to blow back hard." Carter, leaning against the wall, just said, "Good." The atmosphere in the station shifted as word spread that the chief was ordering an emergency bail hearing. Reporters were already gathering outside. Phones buzzed as whispers flew through the town. Martha sat perfectly still, listening to the hum of activity as if she were back in her classroom, letting her students argue until they heard themselves. She folded her hands in her lap and thought of Robert, of the boy Elijah had been, of the man he had become. "They think they've won," she murmured softly to herself. "But they don't know you yet, Robert, or him." And when Elijah returned from the office, nodding once to his mother, there was no mistaking it. The battle had just shifted. The quiet, patient woman in pearls had just been given her first victory, and the men who framed her had no idea what kind of storm they had just invited into Westwood County. By noon, the courthouse steps looked like a stage set for a revolution. Reporters packed the sidewalk, cameras on tripods pointing toward the wide stone staircase. Curious onlookers gathered too, drawn by the promise of spectacle. The beloved schoolteacher who had become a headline overnight was about to make her first appearance since the arrest. The black SUV stopped at the curb, and silence rippled across the crowd as its doors opened. Elijah stepped out first, his presence enough to make even the noisiest reporter lower their voice. Marcus followed, laptop bags slung like a weapon, then David, his crisp suit perfectly at odds with the faint scars that peeked from his collar. And then came Martha. She wore the same black dress from the night before, but she had pressed it until not a wrinkle dared show. Her pearls gleamed in the pale light. Her posture was straight, her steps measured. The murmurs of the crowd hushed into something close to reverence. "She looks like a judge herself," someone whispered. Elijah offered her his arm as they climbed the steps together. To anyone watching, they looked less like defendant and escort and more like royalty arriving for coronation. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with quiet chaos. Judge Sandra Reynolds, a no-nonsense woman with salt-streaked hair and a reputation for being incorruptible, had agreed to hear the emergency bail petition. The prosecutor's office had scrambled to send a representative, and reporters had been granted limited seating inside. Victor Preston stood near the back of the room, pale and jittery, fiddling wit. To the cufflink that kept slipping from his sleeve, he had expected Martha to look small, frightened. Instead, she looked untouchable. And now Elijah Johnson was standing just feet away, radiating the calm of a man who knew exactly how many exits the room had. Across town, Charles Remington poured himself a drink in his penthouse office, staring out at the city he believed he owned. His phone buzzed with updates. The hearing was going forward despite his instructions to delay it until Monday. "Handle it," he snapped to his lawyer over speakerphone. "I don't care what it takes. Raise the bail so high she couldn't pay it if she sold the house and half the district with it." "Yes, sir," came the reply, but even over the phone he could hear the hesitation. Back at the courthouse, Judge Reynolds entered and everyone rose. The gavel struck once, silencing the room. "Mrs. Johnson," the judge said, peering over her glasses, "you've been held since last night on suspicion of grand theft. No formal charges have been filed beyond the initial booking. The court will hear arguments as to why you should or should not be released on bail pending investigation." The young assistant district attorney looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Your Honor," he began, "the value of the missing item is over $1 million. We believe Mrs. Johnson is a flight risk." David stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client has lived in this community for 50 years. She has no criminal record, owns property, and taught 3 generations of this county's children to read. She is as far from a flight risk as one can imagine. The prosecution offers no evidence connecting her to this alleged crime beyond the word of a gallery owner whose security cameras conveniently failed during the incident." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Cameras failed?" "Yes, Your Honor," David said, sliding a document forward. "We have digital logs proving the system went offline for exactly 20 minutes. The same 20 minutes during which the necklace supposedly vanished. The outage was manual, not accidental." A murmur rippled through the room. Preston's Adam's apple bobbed visibly as Elijah's eyes flicked toward him. Judge Reynolds tapped her pen against the bench. "Prosecution, do you have evidence beyond Mr. Preston's statement?" The young ADA glanced nervously toward Preston, who looked suddenly very interested in the floor. "No, Your Honor." "Then I see no justification for continued detention," Reynolds said. "Bail is set at $1,000. Elijah had already prepared the cashier's check. The bailiff accepted it, stamped it, and a subtle but undeniable shift rolled through the courtroom. Martha Johnson was no longer a prisoner. She was a free woman. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Your Honor," David said quickly, "we are filing motions for full disclosure of all communications between Remington Enterprises and the gallery on the day of the alleged theft, as well as requesting an independent audit of the gallery's financial records. We believe this case is part of a targeted harassment campaign designed to force Mrs. Johnson off her property." The judge considered, then nodded. "Motion granted. I want those records on my desk within 48 hours. This court will not be used as a weapon in a property dispute." The room erupted with murmurs again, reporters scribbling furiously. Preston tried to slip toward the door, but Marcus was already there, blocking his exit with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You should talk," Marcus said quietly. "The longer you wait, the less leverage you have. And trust me, my boss always gets the truth." Preston swallowed hard. "Geez." Lancing toward Elijah, who stood silently with his hands clasped behind his back. There was no threat in his stance, just quiet certainty. Across the gallery, Emma Wilson stood near the back, clutching her bag so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't meant to come, but something had pulled her here. As she watched Martha walk out of the courtroom to cheers from neighbors and former students, shame burned hot in her chest. She knew where the necklace was. She had seen it. And if she didn't speak soon, she wasn't sure she'd be able to live with herself. The courthouse steps were nearly impassable by the following morning. What had started as a handful of curious spectators had swelled into a full-scale crowd. Neighbors, students, church members, activists with homemade signs demanding justice. News vans lined the block like a barricade, their satellite dishes tilted skyward. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Reynolds had ordered a full evidentiary hearing after receiving preliminary documentation from Elijah's team overnight. Every seat was filled, reporters huddled like vultures at the back. The smell of coffee and tension mingled under the high ceilings. Martha sat at the defense table, calm as a stone in a river, though she could feel the current rushing around her. Elijah stood just behind her, silent, a sentinel whose presence radiated the promise of action. Across the aisle, Victor Preston looked pale and hollow-eyed. He had barely slept. The wire transfer Marcus uncovered had been traced to him, and Marcus had handed the evidence over to David with a smile that said this was just the beginning. When the bailiff called the court to order, the room went still. Judge Reynolds entered, her robe swishing as she sat. "Before we proceed," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, "I have reviewed the preliminary evidence submitted by the defense. The allegations are serious. I will hear sworn testimony today from all relevant parties." The first witness called was Preston himself. He walked to the stand like a man headed to the gallows. After being sworn in, he sank into the chair and folded his hands tightly. "Mr. Preston," David began smoothly, "did you report to police that you personally saw Mrs. Johnson near the display case just before the necklace went missing?" "Yes," Preston said, voice tight. "And did you actually see her take the necklace?" A beat. The gallery held its breath. "No." "Then why identify her?" Preston swallowed, darting a glance toward the back of the room where two of Remington's lawyers sat, stony-faced. "I was advised." "Advised by whom?" Preston hesitated. "By Mr. Remington. He told me that if her reputation was ruined, the neighborhood would turn on her and she'd be forced to sell." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled madly, and even Judge Reynolds had to bang her gavel once for order. "Let the record reflect," the judge said crisply, "that this witness has identified Charles Remington as the person who instructed him to accuse Mrs. Johnson without direct evidence." Across town in his glass-walled office, Remington slammed his whiskey glass against the table as the news alert hit his phone. "Get my attorneys," he snapped. "All of them." Back in the courtroom, Elijah, his gaze locked on Preston like a hawk. "Where's the necklace now?" David asked. "In my office safe," Preston admitted, shoulders slumping. The room erupted again, this time with outrage. Judge Reynolds' face was like carved stone. "You will surrender that necklace to the sheriff's office immediately," she ordered. "And you, Mr. Preston, are remanded to custody pending charges for false reporting and conspiracy to obstruct justice." Two deputies stepped forward, but before they could lead Preston away, a commotion at the back of the room turned heads. Emma Wilson had stood up. "Your Honor," she said, voice shaking but growing steadier with each word, "I have something to say." Judge Reynolds' sharp gaze softened a fraction. "Step forward, Miss Wilson." Emma walked the long aisle, her shoes loud against the polished wood floor. She looked first at Martha, whose calm nod gave her the courage she needed. "I saw Mr. Preston take the necklace," Emma said, her voice clear now. "He did it while everyone was watching James Turner give his speech. He told me later it was necessary for business and that if I wanted to keep my scholarship and my job, I'd better stick to his story about Miss Johnson." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Elijah's jaw tightened, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. This young woman had just risked everything. "Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement to that effect?" David asked. "Yes," Emma said, her chin lifting. "I'm done being scared." Remington's lawyers leapt to their feet. "Objection. This is hearsay and prejudicial." "It is direct eyewitness testimony," Judge Reynolds cut in. "Objection overruled." Emma was sworn in on the spot, her trembling hand steadying as she repeated the oath. When she stepped down, Martha reached out and touched her hand briefly. "Thank you, child," she whispered. Outside the courtroom, cameras were already broadcasting updates live, and across town, Remington's PR team was frantically drafting statements, but they were losing control of the narrative. During a recess, Elijah stepped outside to take a call from Marcus. "The feds just flagged Remington Enterprises," Marcus said. "They've been monitoring suspicious land acquisitions across 3 counties. Our data dump just gave them enough to move." Elijah's lips curved in a thin smile. "Good. Let them move fast." When court resumed, Judge Reynolds addressed the room. "In light of today's testimony, this court is referring the matter to the State Attorney General's office for potential civil rights violations and racketeering investigation. This is no longer just a theft case. This is about systemic corruption." The crowd buzzed with energy. For the first time since her arrest, Martha allowed herself a deep breath. Justice was no longer just a dista, de hope. It was moving toward them like a train that couldn't be stopped. By the next morning, Westwood County had transformed. What began as murmurs of curiosity had grown into a tidal wave of outrage. The courthouse lawn was now crowded with handmade signs. "Justice for Miss Johnson," Save the Heritage District and no one is above the law. Reporters from state and national outlets had arrived, turning the steps into a makeshift press pool. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a live wire. Everyone knew today would be the turning point. Charles Remington himself had been subpoenaed and was expected to testify. Rumor had it that the FBI would also make their presence official. Martha sat at the defense table, hands folded, pearls glowing softly under the light. She didn't need to speak. Her very presence had become the heart of the story. Elijah sat behind her, motionless but radiating the kind of controlled power that made even the deputies keep their distance. Then the doors opened. Remington strode in with his lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. His suit was perfect, his hair meticulously slicked back, but there was something brittle about the way he held himself, as if the very air in the courtroom pressed on him. Judge Reynolds entered moments later, her gavel cracking like a shot. "This hearing will come to order." David stood first. "Your Honor, in light of new testimony and documentary evidence, we request that Mr. Remington be called to the stand for direct examination." Remington's lead attorney, Barrett, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client has not been charged with a crime. Compelling him to testify under these circumstances would be denied," Reynolds said firmly. "Mr. Remington, take the stand." A ripple went through the gallery. Remington moved to the witness chair, his jaw clenched. He took the oath without looking at Martha. "Mr. Remington," David began, voice calm but cutting. "Did you, or did you not, instruct Mr. Preston to accuse my client of theft?" "I advised him to be vigilant about suspicious activity," Remington replied smoothly. David pressed. "Did you instruct him to name Martha Johnson specifically?" "No." David nodded, almost pitying. "Then can you explain this?" He pressed a key and Marcus's laptop screen mirrored onto the courtroom monitor. An audio recording played, crystal clear. Remington's own voice filled the room. "Frame the old woman. Make it impossible for her to stay in that house. The Heritage District needs to be cleared by year's end." The room went deathly still. The color drained from Remington's face. Barrett leapt to his feet, objecting, but Judge Reynolds silenced him with a glare. "This recording was obtained from the gallery's security archives," David explained. "It is admissible and has been authenticated by the FBI." As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened and several federal agents entered, badges displayed. The lead agent, a tall woman in a dark suit, approached the bench and handed Judge Reynolds a folder. "This is a federal warrant," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "Charles Remington is under investigation for conspiracy, racketeering, and civil rights violations. Agents are currently executing search warrants at his offices and residence." Remington shot to his feet. "This is harassment," he barked. "I built this town. I put half these people in their jobs." Judge Reynolds. His gaze was icy. "And now you will answer for how you used that power. Bailiff, take Mr. Remington into custody pending federal transfer." The bailiff stepped forward, but Remington tried to push back. "Do you know who I am?" he roared, voice cracking. "Yes," Judge Reynolds said sharply, "and so does the law." As the bailiff fastened handcuffs on Remington's wrists, cameras clicked like a storm of insects. Outside, the crowd erupted as news spread. The once untouchable man was being taken away. Martha watched silently, her face calm, her shoulders squared. There was no gloating, no triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen justice hold its ground. Emma Wilson sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. When Martha rose to leave, Emma stood and hugged her. "You saved more than your home," she whispered. "You saved all of us." Outside on the courthouse steps, Elijah paused, letting his mother take the lead. Reporters surged forward, but the crowd hushed as Martha turned to face them. "This was never just about me," she said, her voice steady but carrying with the authority of a bell. "It was about every family who has been told they don't belong, about every neighbor who has been pressured to leave their home, about every person who has been told that money matters more than justice. Today we proved that Westwood belongs to all of us." The applause rolled like thunder. Elijah stood a step behind her, watching with quiet pride. His mother didn't just survive, she had become the symbol of resistance, the voice that could no longer be silenced. That night, as the Heritage District gathered in Martha's backyard with candles and food, James Turner unveiled a new painting, a mural of Martha standing at the courthouse steps, hand clasped with Elijah's. The community gathered behind them. "We almost lost this," James said, voice breaking. "But we didn't, because she stood." Martha looked at the faces lit by the glow of candles, neighbors young and old, some who had nearly given up hope. "Justice isn't given," she said softly. "It's made. And tonight we've made some." From the edge of the yard, Elijah watched her. Not the soldier now, but the son. For the first time in days, the weight in his chest eased. He knew his flight tomorrow would take him far from Westwood, but the town no longer needed his protection. It had found its own courage, and so had his mother.